So let's have a look at some of the details of the exam. This is a 30-minute exam, pretty short, and you've got 20 multiple choice questions. I mean, there's plenty of time. Supervised, yes. That just means there'll be an invigilator and you cannot cheat. You cannot look at your notes, and you've got to get at least 13 out of those 20 questions correct. So you don't even have to get them all right. Now, in terms of the content of the exam, what's being tested, there's 4 areas, we're told, on the syllabus. Now, the biggest area, and they're weighted, right? So they're not all worth the same number of marks. So the most heavily weighted area, 35%, okay, is actually on machine learning, an introduction to machine learning. And the idea seems to be that 7 questions they're going to devote to machine learning. What's the second most heavily weighted area? It's this one, which is 30%, not as much as 35%, and this is examples of AI. Okay. So maybe it's thinking optical character recognition, automatic cars. Just okay, yeah. Just listing examples of AI. Okay. So, but also the benefits, challenges, and risks of AI. So they're going to give 6 questions for that kind of thing. Any challenges of AI? What's problematic about AI? There's this bit. Oh, we better do it in order. And then the third most heavily weighted area is kind of just an introduction to AI, and 5 questions will be on that. An introduction on history and also historical questions on AI. Maybe those are questions naming particular people who said that machine learning involves a performance measure and a program that improves with experience. Blah blah blah. So 5 questions will kind of be on basic matters related to AI. In other words, an introduction and historical matters. And then the fourth, there is this lightly covered area, the fourth area. Only 10% of marks go to this, and it's about the future. How will humans and machines, or AI agents, behave or interact in the future? But yeah, again, the most heavily weighted areas are an introduction to ML, machine learning, and remember that is just a specific subset of AI. Not all artificial intelligence is necessarily machine learning. But also examples of AI. They're the 2 big ones, right? So we talked about this section, the kind of historical section. Candidates will be able to recall the general definition of human and artificial intelligence. Notice that we have to actually define human intelligence. We often forget to do that. And actually there's a lot of questions that come up in the exam which are kind of strange, and where they say which of these is an example of human intelligence: watching a movie, applying for a job, identifying a horse in a foggy field, or running a marathon. And I actually think that's not so obvious. Watching a movie potentially involves intelligence. You have to remember the events that occurred in the first part and relate them to the second part. You can't just... You've got to understand jokes, and I don't... Running a marathon does involve intelligence. But it turns out the answer to that was identifying a horse in a foggy field, and it's getting at something there, but I don't know what. So, define those 2 things, human and AI, human and artificial intelligence. Describe learning from experience and how it relates to machine learning. They're really talking about Tom Mitchell's definition there of machine learning. Tom Mitchell, he just says machine learning, it's nothing but this. All it is does this program improve with experience? In a way, it's quite a simple, but of course then you have to ask, well, what does it mean for it to improve? Does it improve? Does this particular program improve? and what is experience. But anyway. Understand that ML, machine learning, is a significant contribution to the growth of AI, the broad area. Remember, ML is a subset of AI. Okay. So even in this introductory part, we're talking about machine learning. And finally, describe how artificial intelligence is part of something called universal design and the fourth industrial revolution. Okay. So that's that historical module. Then there's this part, which is the big one, 30% of the exam on examples of AI. Candidates will be able to explain the benefits of our AI and list advantages of machine and human and machine systems, describe the challenges of AI and give general examples of the limitations of AI compared to human systems, general ethical challenges AI raises. Demonstrate understanding of the risks of artificial intelligence and give at least one general example of the risks of AI. Identify a typical funding source for AI products, strangely down to earth, 2.4. And 2.5, list opportunities for AI. Okay. So this second module is the closest that the exam gets to asking you to think and be evaluative, because frankly it's just a very superficial exam. You just get the basic terminology. But here we want you to describe challenges of artificial intelligence. That's not just about facts. You're saying this is a challenge and the benefits. So it's a very evaluative section, that section. This is the machine learning section, an introduction to machine learning. As we said, a subset of AI. Candidates will be able to demonstrate understanding of the AI intelligent agent description. This talk of intelligent agents we find in the book, which is in the list of recommended books, by the book co-authored by Peter Norvig and Stuart Russell. Identify the differences with machine learning. I'm not sure what that means, the differences with machine learning. Does it mean the differences between AI and machine learning? Maybe. List the 4 rational agent dependencies. Okay. Describe agents in terms of some performance measure, an environment, an actuator, and a sensor. Describe 4 types of agent: reflex, model-based reflex, goal-based, and utility-based. You can certainly what they're getting at here is something that we find in the book again by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, where they say they kind of move up between these different types of agents, and it's basically in an order of increasing complexity. Each one is a bit of an improvement on the other. You could have a reflex agent that imagine you're designing an automatic car, and it just says, when I see the brake light of the car in front, apply the brakes to my own car. And it's kind of just a reflex, and then you realise, well, that will only get you so far, so then you build a car that has a goal, get me to my destination, and then you realise, well, you don't want actually your car to start ploughing across a field that doesn't belong to you or isn't part of the road network, and a car that starts achieving the goal by breaking the law. And so we eventually then proceed to this even more competent way of thinking, which is a utility-based thing, which we're now asking the machine to take into account legality and comfort of the journey. So 3.2, give typical examples of machine learning in business, in social media and science. Recall which typical narrow AI capability is useful in ML and AI agents functionality. Okay, I don't know what that is. What is the typical narrow AI capability that's useful in ML? Describe and give examples of the following forms of machine learning: supervised, unsupervised, reinforcement. And finally, 3.5, describe the basic schematic of a neural network. They've spelt it neutral. 4. The future of AI. Can we work together? This is the little topic, only 10% of marks will go to this. Demonstrate an understanding. Candidates will be able to demonstrate an understanding that AI, in particular machine learning, will drive humans and machines to work together. Okay, will they? So the exam very much favouring the view that that is what will happen. 4.2, list future directions of humans and machines working together. Okay. They also give a record. So those are the four areas. On the syllabus, you'll also find a recommended reading list. And the books that they list fall into these general areas. So one area is consciousness. How does AI relate to consciousness? Can a machine become conscious? Some books are related to machine learning. Some books are kind of from the perspective of managing and for managers and consultants, almost, and taking into account political and socio-economic factors. And finally, I think there's a section of books interested in algorithms and planning. So, for example, when it comes to consciousness, this area, you might think about looking at these books, particularly I think David Chalmers' book called The Conscious Mind. He's an Australian philosopher, and he introduces the hard problem of consciousness. So he looks at more particular questions. What are we asking when it comes to consciousness? Are we just asking how can physical systems give rise to non-physical things, or are we asking something more? Keith Frankish and William Ramsey, they have their book called The Cambridge Handbook of AI. You've got Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig's book called Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. And that originally came out actually in 1996. Stuart Russell has helped to lay out the ways of thinking about AI that have shaped others in their work on AI. And also Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. So 4 books to do with consciousness. As we said, this is the title page of David Chalmers' book, The Conscious Mind. He's interested in mind. What can have a mind? Can a computer have a mind? There'll be some arguments that it can, some arguments that it can't. And each of those arguments will have premises and a conclusion. David Chalmers has a section of his book which is devoted to AI. In the rest of the book, he's interested in more general matters, what is experience and so forth, or formulating the questions that need to be answered. The hard problem of consciousness, for example. What it means for one thing to supervene on another thing. So all sorts of occasionally fairly technical philosophical things. But it has a chapter on AI, and this is the conclusion. The conclusion is that there do not appear to be any in-principle barriers to the ambitions of AI. The external objections, because he introduces this distinction between external objections and internal objections. Now, external objections say, you know what, computers will never be able to simulate the behaviour of intelligent humans. Okay, so they won't even be able to simulate it to look like they are humans. But then there are internal objections, and they say that that machines won't be able to have minds because there'll never be any inner life. Yes, they may be able to appear as an intelligent human and simulate the behaviour of an intelligent agent completely successfully, but there's nothing on the inside. It's kind of an illusion. So he introduces this distinction between external objections, but then the internal objections. And here's his conclusion again. So he's saying the external objections, you can't even simulate human behaviour. Well, they do not appear to carry much force. The internal objections may be more worrying, but none of the arguments for these objections seem to be compelling on analysis. And indeed, if the arguments I have so in other words, none of the arguments for these objections, so these people who say machines can never have minds and become intelligent, he's actually saying you're not arguing very well for it. So if the arguments I have given in previous chapters are correct, then we have good positive reason to believe that implementation of an appropriate computation will bring conscious experience along with it. So the outlook for machine consciousness is good in principle, if not yet in practice. He's saying computers will be conscious. I've said a little about just what sort of computation is likely to suffice for conscious experience. So he's just said it's possible, right? He's not said how complicated would it have to. Clearly, your calculator isn't conscious, but what computation? What would it be? Where do you say, right, now the machine's conscious? So he's not said much about that. In most of the arguments, I have used a neuron-by-neuron simulation of the brain as an example, but it is likely that many other sorts of computations might also suffice. It might be, for example, that a computation that mirrors the causal organisation of the brain at a much coarser level could still capture what is relevant for the emergence of conscious experience. And it is likely that computations of an entirely different form, corresponding to entirely different sorts of causal organisation, could also give rise to rich conscious experiences when implemented. Okay, a bit of a taste of what he's saying. David Chalmers. This picture is equally compatible with the symbolic and connectionist approaches to cognition. We'll learn about these in turn. What's a symbolic approach to cognition? And with other computational approaches as well. Indeed, one could argue that the centrality of computation in the study of cognition stems from the way that computational accounts can capture almost any sort of causal organisation. So he's saying, why, when people study cognition, which is the process of coming to know things, which of course all humans have, why do we suppose computation to be the main thing that makes cognition happen? Well, because computational accounts can capture almost any sort of causal organisation. So he's linking this idea of causes to computation. We can see computational formalisms as providing an ideal formalism for the expression of patterns of causal organisation, and indeed, in combination with implementational methods, as an ideal tool for their replication. Now, I am aware this may not mean much to you. However, this is just a first go at it. Whatever causal organisation turns out to be central to cognition and consciousness, we can expect that a computational account will be able to capture it. So he's leaving it open that there could be different causal organisations. Okay. All he means by that is some sort of structure whereby one thing causes another thing, like the brain. And he's saying there are different possibilities. He's saying whatever causal organisation turns out to be central to cognition and central to consciousness, we can expect that a computational account will be able to capture it. So even if it turns out not to be computation that's important, we're not going to be going down the wrong path if we focus on computation, as he does. One might even argue that it is this flexibility that lies behind the often cited universality of computational systems. Proponents of artificial intelligence are not committed to any one sort of computation as the sort that might suffice for mentality. The AI thesis is so plausible precisely because the class of computational systems is so wide. So he's really just pushing for the idea that consciousness will be found in machines. So it remains an open question, just what class of computations is sufficient to replicate human mentality? But we have good reason to believe that the class is not empty, so there will be some computations out there. Yep, so that was David Chalmers, a little taste of his book on consciousness. But there are also books devoted to machine learning in the recommended reading list. This is a classic textbook by Tom Mitchell, which came out in 1997. This is a year after you've got Peter Norvig and Stuart Russell bringing out their textbook. Remember what it's called? Their classic textbook on AI called A Modern Approach. They've also got in the recommended reading list on machine learning this book by Oliver Theobald called Machine Learning for Absolute Beginners, a Plain English Introduction. So that's obviously going to be very accessible. So that's a little bit about the syllabus. Now let's look at how you can use the website. So this is bcs.org, and you can find all this information on here. There's information about membership, careers, look at apprenticeships, continuing professional development, and all about the awards. But we're going to click on qualifications and certifications here, and certifications for professionals. You can see that they have exams on all these different things: user experience, DevOps, and this is really good because many of the exams within these areas start from the most foundational levels, so you really can find your way in here. So if we go on AI here, which is what we're interested in, you can see that there's this foundation certificate, the Essentials certificate, and the AI pathway. Now we're interested in BCS Essentials. So take your first steps in AI training to understand the principles of AI, its benefits and risks, and the processes behind machine learning. Who is it for? Individuals with an interest in AI, basically, and managers. Okay, they say there are no entry requirements for this certification. You can click here to download the latest syllabus. They've got a specimen paper and an answer key for that paper, so it gives you 10 multiple choice questions as an example, and that just opens very nicely. So there are two ways to get this certification. You can go through a provider, an accredited training provider, and you'll have to find a training provider near you, or you can just do it through self-study, and if you do that you'll have to pay the exam price of £144. Of course you'll probably have to pay for a training provider as well. The notice is, it says it usually takes a minimum of 40 hours to prepare for the exam, so that's quite a lot of time. What format is the exam? It's a 30-minute exam, nice and short, just half hour, and you've only got 20 multiple choice questions. You've got to get 13 of those 20 questions right to pass, at least 13. And the idea is that next you might take this, if you've successfully complete the BCS Essentials certificate, you can get the BCS Foundation certificate in Artificial Intelligence. And that is 40 multiple choice questions, and now that's 1 hour, so it steps it up a bit. But again, no entry requirements. Okay, so that is a little bit about the syllabus and the resources you can find on the BCS Essentials certification.